Welcome back! Today we're talking about Don Quixote again, Part 1, Chapters 5 through 7. In this section, we get to meet several new characters, including Don Quixote's friends, the curate and the barber, as well as his housekeeper and his niece. And finally, we get introduced to one of the other most important characters in this novel, Sancho Panza. As you remember from last time, Don Quixote fared rather badly with the merchants, and had to be carried home by a passing neighbor. He arrives home to find his family all excited and upset because he's charged off into the world, and they don't know what's become of him, and here he is, finally dragged home all beaten up. Don Quixote's housekeeper, who's a rather hard-headed old woman, decides to go through his house and cleanse it of all the books that have driven him crazy. His niece comes along to help, although she seems to be a slightly more complex character. It's the curate and the barber who are really going to be developed further on, though. They take personal responsibility in helping Don Quixote and curing him of his madness. The first thing they do, once they get Don Quixote in bed with a little food and some rest, is go into his library and begin to purge it. They look through all of his books, seeing all these texts of romance and poetry, and begin to destroy them one after another. This section is interesting because it's a direct commentary upon the writing of the day. Cervantes was pointing out flaws in the writings that had led to Don Quixote's madness in the story, but also just generally bad romances that were so prevalent in his time period. He does, however, credit a few of them with being original and interesting, and preserves them. The most interesting moment of all in the purging of the library scene is when the curate comes across Cervantes' own book in the library. And he comments upon Cervantes' book saying, "Oh, this is an okay book, it has a lot of potential, maybe the next book will be even better." And he preserves Cervantes' work. Again, there's some complexity in when everything happens within this story. After all, this appears to be an older story that was written down and translated, and yet here's a very contemporary novel sitting on Don Quixote's shelf. The housekeeper is happy to burn as many of the books as she possibly can, and when the curate and the barber are interrupted in their scrutiny of the library, she goes ahead and burns all the rest of the books. In order to further their cause of healing Don Quixote, they seal up the door where his library used to be and make it into a wall. When Don Quixote comes looking for a book, there's a wall there now. And he asks where his library has gotten to. And at first, the housekeeper says, well, the devil blew it all away. Don Quixote's niece, however, responds differently. She says, "It was not the devil," cried the niece, "but an enchanter that conveyed himself hither in a cloud, one night after your worship's departure, and alighting from a dragon on which he was mounted, entered the room, where I know not what he did, but having stayed a very little while, he came flying through the roof, leaving the whole house full of smoke. And when we went to see what he had done, we could neither find books nor room. Only the housekeeper and I can very well remember that when the old wicked conjurer went away, he cried in a loud voice, for that the hatred he bore to the master of those books and room, he had done that mischief, which would afterwards appear. He said also that his name was the sage Munaton." "You mean Freston," said Don Quixote. "I do not know," answered the housekeeper, "whether it was Preston or Friton, but this I am certain of, that his name ended in ton." And we begin to see a trend among Don Quixote's friends. His good friends who believe in good sense and reason go to rather outlandish means to try to cure him of his madness. In fact, they almost always play along. Is it possible that they're just as crazy as he is, and just as into this whole fantasy thing? Why was it necessary to create this elaborate lie of an enchanter stealing away Don Quixote's books, and how is that really supposed to cure him and make him think more rationally? We'll see this trend throughout the rest of the book. In the name of curing Don Quixote, all of his friends tend to act rather crazy and lead rather fantastic lives themselves. In the end, is rationality really winning, or fantasy? Don Quixote stays home for a little while, but continues to argue that the world needs more knights errant. And so finally, after a short period of time, he convinces one of his neighbors and friends, a peasant named Sancho Panza, to become his squire and go out with him and right the wrongs of the world. Sancho Panza is very different from Don Quixote and has a lot of counterpoints to Don Quixote. However, he does have in common that same idealism. After all, he believes Don Quixote's promises to him and goes along with them for quite some time. And even when he begins to doubt the great promises that his master offers to him, he does find the idealism of Don Quixote appealing, and it keeps him coming around. Whereas Don Quixote is almost entirely ethereal. He's all idealism and ideas. Sancho Panza is much more earthy. Sancho Panza loves to eat and enjoy himself in life. His speech is always punctuated with clever sayings which he lays one on top of another, much to Don Quixote's irritation. And this relationship is extremely important because it's the first time in literature that we've really had two guys going out and having a good time together. Companionship in earlier stories was much more romantic. But here we have the tale of two friends who sometimes argue, sometimes bicker, but who back each other up and support each other, and become closer as the novel goes on. It's interesting how the deeper and deeper we get into this novel, especially in part 2, the more we see them rubbing off on each other. Don Quixote begins to quote more and more witticisms and wise sayings, whereas Sancho becomes a little bit more sophisticated in his language. But the real adventure is yet to come. When they start out, they're really going to begin to face the disasters, and Sancho's going to have to come to terms with the fact that his master keeps seeing things that he doesn't see. We'll look at that next time, when we pick up at Chapter 8. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see the previous episode, go ahead and click up here. Or if you'd like to see the next episode, click up here. If you would like to see my corresponding reenactment of this story in a modern sense, as a high school teacher that goes crazy and thinks he's a superhero, you can click here on the narwhal. Or click here and subscribe. I'll see you next time.